Warning: this podcast contains content that some listeners may find distressing. Welcome to the Inner West Library Speaker Series. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the Gadigal and Wangal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. Today our conversation will be between Jess Hill and Rose Smith in relation to Jess's book, See What You Made Me Do. Jess is an investigative journalist and author who has been writing and researching about domestic abuse since 2014. Before that, she was a producer for the ABC Radio, a Middle East correspondent for the Global Mail, and a journalist for Background Briefing. Rose Smith is the founder of Philotimo Jujitsu and creator of the High School Jujitsu programs and all-girls self-defense and martial arts programs for high school students based out of Hunters Hill in Sydney. Philotimo also runs specialised programs in martial arts and wellness for women who have experienced domestic violence. These programs are always free. She has practiced Jiu-Jitsu for 25 years and is a three-time nominee for Australian of the Year for her work in the area of girls and women's self-defense. Please welcome Jess and Rose.
Jess, See What You Made Me Do is an extremely popular book at the Inner West Libraries, and I'm hoping that you might be able to tell us briefly about the book and what surprised and drove you into writing it.
I guess, the book was essentially, it was my attempt to get across the entire phenomenon of domestic abuse in Australia. And look, I still left out really fundamental aspects like child protection is the big one. There were just some things I just couldn't get across without making the book like Encyclopedia Britannica. But what I wanted to do was really disrupt the notion of domestic abuse as a private issue. We talk endlessly about what happens behind closed doors. And what I wanted to show is that, it starts behind closed doors, but even in amongst what happens behind closed doors, a lot of that is also occurring publicly. Like if you hear about, especially men who use coercive control, for example, will sequester their partner's wages. Or may even, in the case, I think it was of Simon Gattani and Rachel Harnham, which was a really high-profile homicide a few years ago in Sydney, Simon Gattani actually went directly to Rachel Harnham's employer and made sure that they paid him directly and not her, or didn't pay her at all. There was I can't remember exactly what it was, but, so what I mean is that basically there's a lot of this stuff that happens in plain view and plain earshot of us. And that's not to mention the fact that when a relationship finishes, there are some people some victim survivors who will be lucky enough for the abuse to end when the relationship does. But for an overwhelming number, that abuse will continue into the court system, into their rental arrangements, things like the perpetrator trashing the place and the victim only realizing at that point that they're the only name on the lease and they're now up for the entire bond and for a bill for the damage. I mean, there are so many ways in which this abuse continues out in public. So I guess what I wanted to show, I subtitled the book Power, Control and Domestic Abuse. And I'm not just talking about the power and control of the perpetrator. I'm talking about the power and control of the state, and how this is like a feedback loop that we go through where you have violence or abuse in the home, and then that abuse can be reinforced and even re-perpetrated by the systems that are supposed to step in and protect victims. I think, the things that surprised me, what absolutely fundamentally reoriented my worldview, and I'm ashamed it hadn't happened earlier, but, was writing the Indigenous chapter. And I think when I was sitting in my car and I dashed out to get something, by this stage I had a 1-year-old, so I'd probably dashed out for like 5 minutes freedom. And I was listening to this podcast called Curtain, and it's hosted by Martin Hodgson, who's a lawyer, and Amy McGuire, who's a journalist. And it's basically about an Indigenous man who was wrongly imprisoned, but they deal with a lot of other Indigenous issues. And I remember Martin had this monologue where he was basically talking about what happens to Indigenous women when they call police if they've been assaulted in a domestic violence incident. And he said, essentially, what happens in a lot of these cases is the police turn up and they do ID checks before they even inquire as to what's happened. And they start arresting people on if they have unpaid fines, you know. And some of these fines, like he gave me a few, not me, gave listeners a few specific examples of, cases in which, there had been a grandmother call, for example, and that she'd ended up being arrested for fines about an unregistered dog. I mean, that's the thing. I sat there listening going, God, I didn't even know you had to register dogs. And here's this woman who's called on behalf of her daughter and who is desperate for police to intervene and expecting them to intervene and help her. And the first thing they're doing is checking her credentials and checking whether she has any outstanding charges. It's just what started to really sink in for me was the punitive response to Indigenous women who call for help. And that, I guess, finally got across to me what kind of situation, I mean, obviously Indigenous people are in this country, but particularly Indigenous women who not only have racism, but also sexism as an intersectional oppression. So researching that chapter just, I think, totally changed my life, not just because of the oppression and reading about what was happening in a punitive sense from police, but also just in really understanding or starting to understand what culture we set out to eradicate when we colonized Australia, and just how much hope and what that culture presents as an alternative to the way that we live now is actually offers so much hope and so much instruction on how we need to reform in order to stop all sorts of things going wrong, from domestic abuse to the abuse of nature, abuse of power, etc. So that, I could recount many, many things that surprised me, but I think if I were to think about one, that was the biggest perspective shift.
It's really full on. I've got to say, I found your book really harrowing to read. And I particularly found one of your first chapters, The Perpetrator's Handbook, really eye-opening, but also really, I guess, depressing when you realize how much we often blame women for what's happening to them. And I think that you actually explained that brilliantly. We hear the expression that men abuse women because society tells them they're entitled to be in control said a lot. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, like I wrote about that in the book, and what I'm talking about is not just that men are told that they are to be in control, but that's what I was talking about before. That whole feedback loop between the system and the individual is that under our patriarchal system, and let's just name it, patriarchy, under that system, control is the absolute locus point of our culture. So, and when I say it, what I mean is, it's like control is like the highest value. And what our culture has really told men and socialized them into believing is that unless they are in control, then they will be out of control and they will be vulnerable and they will be weak, which is really the number one rule of what not to be if you're a real man. So this whole elevation of the notion of control, and that being in control, whether it's being in control of your body, being in control because you're out there robbing a bank, being in control of your family, being in control of your family, even for men who are not abusive, can be a really personal touch point. That they are the breadwinner, they are the ones who are determining what happens in the household, but that's their natural place. That's a really long, it's been in the culture for a really long time. And really, the home is the least touched frontier by the last 40, 50 years of feminism. Even though we can see like there are some areas in which men are starting to sort of like relinquish that control, etc. In the home, it's not untouched, but it's certainly one of those arenas that just has not really had the massive changes that we've seen in other areas of life. And so I think that when you say like sort of men abuse because society tells them that they are entitled to be in control, first is that they're entitled, and entitlement is a huge part of abuse. But the second is, if they're not, they will fail. And so there's a massive amount of fear that's wrapped up in not being in control. And that's why I talk in the book about the sort of coalescing emotions of fear and shame as a background to a lot of these men's abuse, that they feel like they're losing control, They feel like if they aren't sort of, they don't have the upper hand, or if the wife or the partner's not doing things the way they think should be done, that's a form of disrespect. It's a sign that they are out of control, and they can feel shamed and humiliated as a response. The shame is it's an emotion that none of us like. It's an emotion we all want to try to get away from in some way. Some of us will just hang our heads, literally in shame, to try to avoid someone's gaze. Others will want to disappear entirely, go live off in the woods somewhere because they feel so shamed. Others will lash out. And what I talk about in the book is a notion called humiliated fury. And it's the idea that when these men feel this really distinct and overpowering sense of shame and humiliation, that what they do in order to overwhelm that is that they use control or violence, and so in the moment they can regain power, and it expels that feeling of shame. But of course, for a lot of guys who are not, some of these guys who are not narcissistic sociopaths, some of these guys literally do think they love their partners. They are attached to them. They feel very dependent on them, to a point where they feel shamed by that dependence because it's a sign that they're not in control. But where once they've reinstated that power, they can then even feel ashamed of what they've done in that moment. So it's this total feedback loop. And eventually, what entitlement does to a lot of these guys is it makes them think, well, I shouldn't have to feel shame. And they start thinking, well, what's making me feel shame? She's making me feel shame. Every time, I have a bit of a reaction and she makes me feel ashamed for it. So this can be this building resentment. And I think that part of what you see in these guys who are not the the 20 or 30% who are the high grade narcissists, sociopaths, strategic abusers, what you see in these guys is this rolling sense of shame and resentment that then can build into this really sadistic behavior, where you're just like, how could somebody do that to someone, not only someone they love, even someone they know? Why is that person seemingly quite normal on the other side of this, in terms of to their friends or at their workplace? So I think shame tells us a lot about the distortion of men in particular, men's personalities and behavior inside the home in domestic abuse.
Absolutely. I think we probably don't even talk enough about toxic shame, and how we talk about it a lot in talking about codependency. I think it's really interesting. It comes across both as such a toxic force, and there's definitely some similarities, I think. But the other thing that you mention in the book is, and you actually just touched on it a little bit then, speaking about the real injustices that Indigenous women experience when they're, calling the police for help and getting an ID check and arrested for an outstanding fine. In the book, you describe how domestic abuse is often reinforced by the justice system. Can you elaborate on that?
When we talk a lot about the fact that perpetrators will minimize or dismiss acts of, incidents of violence or things that they've done to wrong their partner in domestic abuse. And we see that also happening from the police. And there's one story in the chapter that really talks about one element of the justice system, which is the police response. And there's a woman, Kelly Thompson, who was murdered a few years ago. And, often the stories that really grab the headlines and get our attention is where there's massive catastrophic failures in police response, or, the recent Queensland police officer who shared a victim's details with the perpetrator. That's the sort of thing that makes us, our hackles rise and we get really worked up about. But stories like Kelly Thompson's shows how basically just that initial neglect and minimization and dismissal of an element of what's happened can then start this chain reaction where basically the concerns are not paid high enough attention, and someone who is actually at very high risk and was at very high risk from the first phone call to the police can be deemed low risk. And the way that was done with Kelly Thompson, when you look at the log of what happened, police followed most procedures and policies until they didn't enforce certain breaches later on in the piece. But the first thing that went wrong is that the first responders did not record in the notes that Kelly Thompson had said she'd been choked. And what we know is that choking and strangulation is an absolute red flag for future homicide. And that's why strangulation has been made a crime in Queensland, in Victoria, etc. Or it's yeah, I don't think it was a crime before. So it's been criminalized as a separate and discrete incident because it is so dangerous. And so by not putting that choking on the initial notes, Kelly Thompson's case was deemed low risk. So yeah, when the police called, she didn't answer, but nobody followed up. And that's the thing, is so often police will feel, I guess, like the victim is not cooperating, or like the victim is not helping. And that's because the victim's got their own stuff going on. What the police need to do is act as a protective force, an interventionist force that actually goes in and really makes sure that the victim is okay. Now, Kelly Thompson, though she didn't answer the first phone call, she called police 38 times over the course of a month, and many, many, many failings until the night that her ex-partner murdered her. And even the night of her murder, a neighbour saw him going inside the house, lurking around outside, called the police, and again, a first responder on the line said, well, can you just keep an eye on it and let us know if you hear anything? And this guy, Norman Paskin, he knew that Wayne was not supposed to be outside Kelly's house, that something really seriously wrong had gone on. And if that first responder had had a cursory look in the system, they would have seen that there was an issue and that this needed to be taken seriously. So these are all little failings, individuals who just don't quite do a good enough job, or they don't record a really salient piece of information. And it's just the fact that a lot of police still do not regard domestic abuse to be at the same level of criminality as a break-in or as a regular assault, and don't take it as seriously. So that's where I think, the justice system is often failing women. And then, of course, the family law system is a whole nother kettle of fish, which is not really so much the justice system, but it is a court system, obviously, that goes to allocate care and custody of children. And that is a bun fight.
Yeah. And I think, just thinking about what you said about the police not taking it seriously, one of the things I appreciated is how you followed the story. I think it was Jasmine and Nelson.
Yeah.
And you asked the reader, about compassion, and do you really feel compassionate after you read this what happened? And I thought that was really interesting, because you also just said that the police often feel that the victim isn't cooperating with them. But when you read what happened, you start to get an understanding that they can't always cooperate because they're fearing for their lives. And if they're seen to be cooperating, that could mean they're going to get murdered. So I think, there's going to be some awful retaliation. I think you just made that so clear. And I felt really stressed reading some of those passages and just thinking, oh no, it's like watching a horror movie, except it's real life.
And remembering also that a lot of these, in these especially coercive control relationships where there is a whole system of abuse that never switches off, that a big part of that is the perpetrator demonstrating to the victim that they are omnipotent, that they know everything that is happening. And so you often get, often you get women who have actually literally been tracked either by GPS trackers in their car or by, hidden cameras in their house or surveillance apps on their phone. So literally the perpetrator is demonstrating their omnipotence by quoting back to them things that they've said in private, But in other times, it might be even just that they demand, as in the case of Jasmine and Nelson, if she was in another room of the house, she'd have to send a text message to him with a photo of where she was to prove that she hadn't sort of climbed out the window to go have an affair with someone. This is kind of slave owner behavior. And what the effect is on the woman is the sense that no one can ever keep me safe. I will never, ever be safe unless there is a police officer parked outside my door 24 hours a day. There will be a time he will get to me. And that's how, a lot of women, even when they realize what situation they're in, that threat of omnipresence and the idea that he's willing to do extreme things to either them or their loved ones, that is often what keeps women in these relationships, because it's a sense that I will never ever be safe, and it's better the devil I know inside these four walls than the devil I don't, which is what happens when he leaves and I don't have tabs on him.
Yeah, 100%.
So I mean, we got introduced to each other a couple of years ago when I was heavily pregnant, and you part of what I was trying to ascertain from you is how much a training in martial arts, especially for teenage girls or younger, might actually sort of serve to interrupt the types of, I guess, the types of, I don't want to say behaviors, but some vulnerabilities that exist in women and are socialized into women. Stuff like not being able to really speak their mind, having to shelter their intelligence in order to be attractive, not being able to really connect with their own pain and being separate from their own bodies. And what I was really fascinated by is the work that you do with young girls and young women that isn't just about training in martial arts, but is also about sort of trying to interrupt that socialization. So can you tell me how you think martial arts training is relevant in when we're talking about prevention of domestic abuse?
Yeah, look, it's a really big question, and you and I obviously have had some really great conversations about this. And I don't know that I have 100% answers, but what I do think is that studying a martial art can be one tool in a suite of tools that can help to empower women and girls to make good choices for themselves. I've been a long time fan of the work, and actually a user of the work of Pia Melody, and she really pioneered a lot of study and work in the area of codependence. And I think that one of the things, again, that struck me when I read your book and I read about coercive control is how much of it sounds like codependency. Now, there's no magic pill we can take to stop people from being codependent, because so much of that's got to do with the family that you were born into, even the birth order that you have and how your family behaves. Were they toxic? Were they healthy? All that, were you parented well? Did your parents neglect you? All those things obviously have so much to do with somebody becoming even a domestic abuser. And also, for women, we're socialized to be the caretakers, to look after people, to make sure everybody's happy, to look after you when you're sick, to do everything. That's a pretty toxic mix to put together if you don't value yourself enough to be able to say, no, I'm not putting up with it. And so I don't have a magic bullet. Once a woman is in a situation where there is a coercive control, domestic violence, it's not as easy as just saying no. It's as you so succinctly put it in the book, it's been, death by 1,000 paper cuts. By the time, you realize you're unsafe, you can't get out anymore. It just built up slowly. Or the other analogy you used was the frog in the boiling water, and it's too late by the time you realize you're being scalded to death. But I think that martial arts can give women a sense of mastery over their own bodies. And with that mastery over your own body, you're suddenly using your body as this amazing vehicle that can do these amazing things, instead of this object that should be sexualized and photographed, with your boobs out for Instagram. Not that there's anything wrong with doing that if that's what you want to do, but if that's all you want to do with your body and you don't think that it's worth anything else, then I think that's really problematic for young women. And I find that within my programs, I get a lot of young girls coming in that have got no real sense of where their bodies begin and end. They don't know how to use them. And so through doing the martial arts training, they start to get a sense of the power that they have. That doesn't mean they can go out and punch on with giant men and win the fight. That's not what we're training for. It would also be unrealistic to suggest that's something we can do. But we can start to develop a sense of being able to control ourselves and sometimes, physically those around us, and to develop a sense of being able to see, one of the things that the girls talk about a lot and I'd love to do a study into it, but one of the things they talk about a lot is the girls that practice sparring, free sparring, which is kind of like you're trying to hit and kick each other in a controlled environment. One of the things that they say is that initially when they start learning how to do it, it feels really scary and terrifying and it's very confronting. But as they practice more and more, time seems to slow down within the session when they're sparring, and they say the movements look really slow and they're able to get out of the way. I think that's really interesting. So in some way, their brains are training them instead of that flinchy, oh, here it comes kind of response that any of us would have if somebody just threw their hand out at us. They see it in almost like a slow motion. They've practiced so many times, they see it coming and they can get out of the way. And with that kind of confidence, I wonder, along with all the stuff we're teaching them in the classes about codependency, about loving yourself, about self-care, and about self-worth, I wonder if all of that together maybe can help them the first time that someone treats them disrespectfully to be able to say, I know what this is, I've learnt what this looks like, and I'm not afraid of you, so I'm going to walk away. I don't know.
Yeah, and I think that there's no guarantee that any amount of education or coming from a loving home or is going to prevent you from being in an abusive relationship. But I've heard so many times women say, I had my instinct was telling me early on that something was wrong, but they in that way of being socialized to be in relationship, and as you say, to sort of put, let's say, in a binary heterosexual sense, to put the men's feelings first and to push aside their own instinct in order to preserve the reputation and feelings of the man that they're with, that's often the first thing that goes wrong and the first thing that starts to trap them. And what I think, I've, in talking to your students, what I've found is what they really seem to connect with through that physical mastery is instinct, right? And they value their instinct and they know their instinct, and they don't feel like their instinct is something that is disadvantaging them. Whereas, if you look at the work of Carol Gilligan about, when girls start to lose their voices at age around 12 or 13, where they start to really get the message that if they were to follow their instinct and say what they thought, they'd be unpopular with friends and they definitely would not be able to be in a relationship. That what they need to do is just quieten down, don't be a loudmouth, just go with the flow, and ultimately put their own instincts and needs aside in order to prioritize the needs of others. And so I think that, I don't think studying martial arts like makes you arrogant and like everyone get out of my way, but I think it can rebalance some of that kind of lack of connection to instinct. And that's what I think that when people say, we've seen, you and I have seen recently, particular feminists talking about they're so outraged by the idea that women would be encouraged to study martial arts as a way to defend, or as a way to prevent domestic abuse. I think that it's a really shallow interpretation to look at the physical, like the actual physical ability to defend oneself or use violence. That's actually like the last order issue when we're talking about its prevention power.
100%. And look, Carol Gilligan is spot on. 12 to 13 is also the age most girls drop out of organised sport. So, there's a whole lot of issues going on. I also think, we could have a whole podcast about why girls don't do sport. We're not going to get into that today, but we don't make it easy for them. And I think you might remember that first time when you came out to see the class, and I stopped the class and I said to the girls, how many of you, after your first lesson, were so excited, you went home and you showed your dad or your brother or your uncle or a male relative the first thing that you'd learned how to do, and it didn't work, and they basically told you, see, you don't know what you're doing, you can't defend yourself. And all those hands went up in the air. And of course, it's a really interesting thing. These dads, who love their daughters, send them off to martial arts. And then as soon as she comes home and says, daddy, grab my wrist or put your hands around my throat and I'm going to show you how I can get out of this technique. And then they hold so tight or they are so, strong that the girls can't make the technique work and they're utterly defeated, and they come back to class the next lesson going, I was a total failure. And the first thing I ask them is, how many of you actually tried to hurt them? And there's always silence. And then I say, now I want you to go home. And this time, I want you to do the whole thing again, and I want you to scream in their face as soon as they touch you. And I just want you to get your hand, and I want you to just put it right in their face and push them away. And then do the technique.
How does that go down?
It goes down brilliantly because it works. Because it works. I do also tell them, don't do it somewhere where dad can fall on a table. But
sure.
I'm like, well, I had a father, God, not one father, it won't be the only one, but I'm a female martial arts instructor. So I'm already an anomaly in my chosen field because it's very male dominated. And, female martial artists are often considered to be not as good, not as strong. And I had a father come in with his daughter and say, oh, this isn't real, self-defense, is it? I mean, it's not like the UFC where, it's no holds barred. And I was like, mate, UFC has rules. You can't fish hook, you can't eye gouge, you can't bite, you can't hair pull, you can't punch someone in the nuts. Why do you think women can't do these things too? I don't want to, and I have no plans to, but I just think it's really interesting that there's this real disconnect. There's this real disconnect between girls going and doing martial arts. It's considered unladylike. It's considered, and as you also mentioned with the certain prominent feminist going off about, women shouldn't learn martial arts and it doesn't matter because it won't work anyway. All I'm going to say to that is 86% of women. Now, this is specific. This is not a domestic violence statistic. This is actually more of a random attack statistic. But 86% of women who fight back in a random attack situation, so, walking down the street or, in the car park or whatever, they fight back, they don't get raped, and they don't sustain further injury. If you had a 86% chance of winning the lottery, you'd go and buy a ticket. So I already think it's worth learning. Where women get into great danger in domestic violence situations is sometimes they fight back without knowing how to fight back, and of course it doesn't work, and they get badly injured, and and that of course deters them obviously from fighting back any further, and totally understandably. But I do think that it can be a most wonderful support for women to just get that mastery over their body, and even if they never use their martial arts, I think that it's a really just a lovely thing to be able to do for yourself, and it does change the way you feel about yourself. So, Jess, it's just been such a privilege to speak with you today, and I can only urge anybody that's listening to go out and see What You Made Me Do, and just read it. And it's harrowing, but it's, it just left me feeling like I want to do even more to help. So what would your message be to all women and men listening to this podcast?
Yeah, thank you so much. And your support's been so gorgeous. And I'd say that, to anyone listening to this podcast, what has been really amazing in the reader feedback that I've got is hearing people really interrogating their own relationships, their own connections with intimacy, their own sort of, negative habits around needing power and control, or how they respond to shame in their own relationships. And I'd say that, as much as absolutely we need to be paying much greater attention to the people around us, and obviously we want to be trying to open up communication channels to anyone who we think might be in a controlling and dangerous relationship, I'd say, attend to yourself first, because domestic abuse is not a phenomenon that happens to other people. It is an extension of something that goes on inside all of our relationships, in that we all have to grapple with issues of power and control. And we all have to grapple with how we respond when we feel shamed. And I know that, personally in my relationship, when it looks like I'm at fault for something, because of certain things in my childhood and whatever, I find it very, very hard to back down, because I feel shamed in that moment that I didn't do what I was supposed to do. I wasn't the perfect partner. And I can respond really badly, and I can arc up, and I can start to get insulting and shut down. And when I actually know in that moment that I've done something wrong, and what I should be doing is apologizing. Now, I'm not saying that I'm a perpetrator, but I think that this all exists within various gradients in our relationships. And until we as a society grapple with our addiction to control and the way in which we use power in negative ways, then the broader issue of domestic abuse will not change.
That's absolutely amazing. And I think it's a really valuable insight. And I definitely would add to that, I'd strongly encourage people to just investigate, see what you made me do, and get reading. And thank you so much, Jess, for spending time with me on this podcast today.
My pleasure. Thank you, Rose.
Cheers.
Thank you very much, Jess and Rose, for today's conversation. I would also like to thank my colleagues Matthew Belaine, Community Projects Officer, and Veronique Delaunay, Library Programs Officer, for their assistance and collaboration in producing this podcast. For more information about domestic violence, please go to the Inner West Council website at the Community Wellbeing/Safety and Wellbeing/Domestic and Family Violence page. Thank you for listening, and look out for upcoming digital content through the Inner West Library What's On and social media channels. Thank you.